Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have a very distinguished audience here today for a distinguished speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Mark Horton, who, as I'm sure you all know, is Professor in Archaeology at the University of Bristol in the UK, which still exists as an entity. Sorry. He is, of course, a historical and maritime archaeologist who has been working on the East African coast since 1980, directing numerous excavations there. He's produced 2 books on East Africa, one on his excavations at Shanga and another history of the Swahili. His particular interest is in the origins of East African Islam and its relationship with the Arabian Gulf, which I'm sure we'll hear about today. He has also worked in Europe, I should add, and the Caribbean, and most recently in North Carolina. So interesting. Are they all connected? As well as being an active archaeologist and historian, he also has a media career, appearing on the BBC regularly, presenting the long-running series Coast with a capital C since 2005. And I should let you know that you can access some of those episodes on YouTube. I just saw one on that wonderful railway from Exeter to Dawlish, built by Brunel.
Dawlish. Brunel's atmospheric railway.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's a nice episode. There's also a nice sort of personality test online where Professor Horton is asked 20 questions, and like all of us, he hesitates when he's asked what his favorite color is or what his favorite food is. But the only thing he didn't hesitate about was when he was asked, who is the person, dead or alive, you'd most like to meet? And he immediately said Mortimer Wheeler, which means he really is an archaeologist. He was one of my heroes as a young boy because he discovered Mohenjo-daro.
That's right.
Yeah. Welcome, Mark Horton, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you very much, Philip, for that warm introduction. It's great to be here. I was here last year for the famous Global Gulf seminar and met many of you there, and it's lovely to be back here in Abu Dhabi, away from the horrors of Europe, the winter and other matters. So I'm going to take you to a lovely, warm and sunny place and tell you a little bit about the exotic world, the land of the Zanj, which of course the word Zanzibar comes from, but is a very ancient term referring to the East African coast that is probably derived from the classical term Azania, and then was employed by many of the Arab and Persian geographers to refer to the section of coast in East Africa that extends really from Somalia right down to Mozambique. So I'm going to take us on a voyage between the 8th and the 10th century, broadly speaking, about why this place is important and why you, people interested in the history of the Gulf, should be interested also in East Africa. But before I start, I thought we might go back to an earlier voyage where, I'm sure many of you know, where the famous mariner, Alan Villiers, who did reconstructions or went on many different historic voyages. He went round Cape Horn in a square rigger, for example. Perhaps his most famous voyage was on the Triumph of Righteousness just before the Second World War in 1938. And he produced a famous book called Sons of Sinbad and recorded how he himself travelled to the land of the Zanj, conjuring up, if you like, a world of the Arabian Nights in the very title of his book. But it was a very workaday voyage, a Kuwaiti dhow that sailed down to Mombasa and then to Zanzibar and then on to the refugee delta. And the principal purpose of this voyage was to collect mangrove poles from the refugee delta, which grow there prodigiously, mangrove poles that were brought back as the standard building material employed in the Gulf up until quite recently when reinforced concrete seems to be more widely employed. But I'm sure you all know of examples where mangrove poles are still employed. And indeed, I took a picture here in Dubai in 2000 1804. I think it was actually a museum reconstruction rather than actually for practical purposes, but it shows you that still those poles were still being used. And I can remember when I first started working in East Africa, dhows would regularly come down to the East African coast and transport mangrove poles back up to the Gulf. So this is an ancient and high bulk trade which continued until living memory. But that was not the only reason why one would want to come to East Africa. East Africa is full of precious and raw materials, which was vital for the commercial systems of the Western Indian Ocean. Commodities like, for example, ivory that we'll come to, gold, which we'll come to, rock crystal, precious stones, but also other items perhaps less exotic or less well known, like skins, civet musk, and a range of other things, copal, ambergris, many of these items which appear as it were, important trade commodities that enabled the exchange networks of the Indian Ocean that extended all the way from the Red Sea and Arabia right the way through to China. And these exotic and precious raw materials were a crucial part. I should also, perhaps slightly hesitantly, also mention manpower was also a very important source from East Africa, a source of what I think we describe as forced labour or unfree labour that was taken at various times. I think one mustn't overestimate the scale of the slave trade. There were various episodic moments in which it was important, and there's one period which we'll come to briefly in this talk. Now, to place this within the slightly wider context of the Indian Ocean, we, of course, have travel narratives that describe people sailing principally to India and on to China. This is the most famous, and Philip has recently produced a new translation published by New York University Press, a wonderful translation by Tim McIntosh Smith of these voyages. The first edition, I should say, in English since we can do the CC's there, 1733, which we had to rely on up until this point. And these described two travel accounts, one in the 850s, an anonymous account that takes the voyage from Siraf all the way through to India, and from then through the Malacca Straits, through to Southeast Asia, and then on to China. And this voyage was described in some detail. Rather annoyingly, it didn't actually describe his return voyage. Historians have generally assumed he came back the same way, but he might not have done, and we'll come back to that in a second. A slightly later version that was produced at the same time, or was bundled in with this 850 voyage, is that of Abu Said al-Sarafi in the 920s. And he doesn't describe his voyage, but rather conveniently describes the places that he went to. And this is a much wider view of the Indian Ocean that extends from the Red Sea, southern Arabia, the Gulf, southern India, Southeast Asia, where he's particularly detailed in his descriptions, Peninsula, Southeast Asia, China, but also critically East Africa. And he describes the societies of East Africa, and he describes how they're very excited, for example, about the date. They bow down. When an Arab comes, they bow down and say, you come from the land of the date. They're obviously extremely keen on dates, and we'll see archaeological evidence for that in a minute. And almost contemporary with this, we have the Wonders of India, which also describe a world of the Indian Ocean. It's kind of halfway to the Sinbad cycle in many ways. Part of it is fantastic narratives about dragons and snakes and all sorts of other things, birds that pick up humans, but also a description of a lot of the ports and activities along the coast around the Indian Ocean, with names of merchants, dates and so forth attached to it. And again, if we see the world of the Wonders of India, we see a similar world that includes both East Africa as well as Southeast Asia, South India, the Gulf, and so forth. So we have, I think, in the 10th century, and probably earlier, a really complicated world in which we're getting the essence, if you like, of globalization, of these connections not just simply a simple voyage from the Gulf to China, but a series of long-distance networks and interrelationships of exchanges of commodities. Now, of course, we know quite a lot about the ships as well. Firstly, we don't know about this one. This was when Tim Severin, of course, replicated the voyage to China, I think in the 1970s, if I'm right, the famous Sohar, sitting on a roundabout now opposite the Parliament Building in Oman. Basically, it's the same boat, but essentially a 19th century dhow. The fact is that it has very little claims to real authenticity, but it gives you an idea maybe of the scale of boats that might have been involved. But more importantly, we now have a series of shipwrecks which are giving us a very clear idea of the sorts of voyages that took place and the maritime capabilities of the people that were involved. The Belitung shipwreck, which is now well known, which was found off the coast of Indonesia, that dates to exactly the same time as that anonymous voyage in the 850s, or maybe a little bit earlier. This contained upwards of 60,000 Chinese vessels of Changsha stoneware, but also sufficient hull structure which enabled the Omani specialist, and Eric Staples is here as the architect of this, to replicate and sail to and actually replicate the voyage to Singapore of the famous Jewel of Muscat. And I'm sure he's lectured to here before, so I won't labour the point, but to say that these are very flexible and extremely seaworthy vessels. And very good to actually combine the experimental archaeology with that of the maritime archaeology, although there were real problems about the recording. It would be lovely to have looked at it in more detail, but alas, I think the shipwreck has gone. More excitingly, a new shipwreck has just come to light in Thailand in a shrimp farm. And this dates to the 8th century rather than the mid-9th century. And this is much bigger than the Belitung ship. The Belitung ship was at 18 metres. The Thai shipwreck is maybe up to 25 metres in size. It's still being excavated at the moment. And is another Western Indian Ocean sewn vessel. It doesn't have much loot on board because essentially it was salvaged, it hit a sandbank and they managed to take all the material out. But it gives you a really real indication, the fact that these ships were extending, this is into Thailand, in the 8th century, and carrying, for example, torpedo jars, which is the type of ceramic vessels associated with the early Islamic period, but also Chinese wares. So here is a piece of Dusan or olive green glazed jar that was found in the shipwreck. So you have both material from the Gulf, but also we have material from China as well found in this shipwreck. So already by the later part of the 8th century, people are moving around. There's another couple of images of the same planks. And we have one image, I think it's fair to say, from historical sources, which is from the famous Harari manuscript, which actually shows a slightly later style of vessel. The wadding is done in a slightly different way, but it gives you an idea maybe of the ethnic makeup of these vessels. We talk about Arabs and Arab navigation, but actually these vessels were made up of many different nationalities. We can see the terrified merchants, for example, below there, who are presumably just buying a part of their passage on board, like a ferry these vessels are. But the crew contains certainly Africans here. There's a very African person up in the crow's nest there. The captain might be South Indian or might be even Ethiopian. There's some debate about it. So we've got a multi-ethnic crew brought from around the Indian Ocean. So it's not Arab shipwrights or Arab sailors alone, but a variety of people are making up these voyages. And clearly the vessels themselves may well also be of great diversity. The key entrepôts of these places are well known, have been excavated, Sohar in Oman, and particularly Siraf, where many of these famous voyages took place. This is one of the house of one of the merchants, a huge, great big structure, which was excavated from the 10th century. And from Siraf, Chinese ceramics and so forth have been found. The dimensions of these rooms, incidentally, are of a size that would be suitable for mangrove poles, and there are historical sources, Ibn Hawkil, for example, that refers to the importation of teak and mangrove poles as roofing materials from East Africa. The Friday Mosque is very interesting, it's quite late, and sits over an early Islamic fortress from the 8th century. But this Friday Mosque platform is key because it contains the rubbish from around 800 that enables us to date many of the sites that we find in East Africa. The chronologies of these things is critical in many ways. And we also have sites, for example, this one in Dubai, which is apparently a similar, some people suggest it's a colony of Sarafi merchants. On the Arabian side, we don't really know for certain. The site hasn't been fully investigated, but there's great similarities in the plans of the houses that have been found there. So we know where people are leaving from. Where exactly are they going? What do we know about East Africa? Let's take a voyage down this coastline. The first thing to say, which is the completely obvious one, I don't need to labour this to an audience here, is that sailing to East Africa is a very easy operation. We have monsoon winds that blow in one direction for 6 months a year and then reverse their direction for the remaining 6 months. So you have a period in which you stay for the change of monsoons in Marchish, and then return back on the southwest monsoon that takes you back to the Gulf. And you can see it's a relatively straight line in which you're at. Effectively, you have to cross the Gulf of Aden, but otherwise it's a relatively coastline type voyage. So while the distances are large, reliable and not particularly strong winds allow one to take these voyages with relative simplicity. Once you get below the latitude of Kilwa, which is here, just about here, the winds get a bit unreliable. And as a result, Kilwa and a bit further south, the Comores, become a key entrepot in this trade because ultimately it's the place where Gulf ships can reach, but have difficulty reaching any further on. But we'll look at this towards the end of the lecture as we get down that bit of the coastline. Okay, so one of the problems that we have in the archaeology and the history of this area is a complete lack of really any serious and reliable documentary evidence. We have snippets from geographers, but essentially in this period we have only 2 eyewitness accounts. Ibn Battuta in the 14th century, who comes by and leaves a rather garbled account from 1331, and al-Mazudi, who gives a much more reliable and detailed account. And he describes that he came down to a town called Kambalu in the company of Sirafi ship owners, and he gives them their name. And he says, the last time I did this voyage was in 916. So Mazudi is a very useful and reliable eyewitness account, but a lot of the other accounts are rather garbled, and it's often very difficult to make much sense of them, so hence the importance of archaeology. An understanding of the Indian Ocean was also rather a curious one. This is Ptolemy's world map of 150, and knowledge really doesn't really move on significantly until the late Middle Ages, the medieval period. There was debate as to whether Africa was joined to Southeast Asia or not, and there was a great deal of confusion in the place names between the 2 areas. You can see that what we have here is kind of like an encircling lake in which the East African coast is seen to come down here endlessly and somehow connect through to island Southeast Asia. So the geographical knowledge of this was somewhat limited, and perhaps this is best summarized by my favourite map of this period, which has recently come to light. It was acquired by the Bodleian Library in Oxford from the Book of Curiosities, a Fatimid map of the mid-11th century that shows the Indian Ocean world just like that Ptolemaic conception of the world. And what's very critical is it shows various East African locations. So if we now go back to the transcription of it, you can see rather conveniently that it has the places of India and China and Yemen and so forth, not quite well in order, but also it has a series of East African islands mentioned, including Unguja, which is Languja or Unguja, which is the place name for Zanzibar, and this other island, Kambalu, which is where al-Mazudi sailed to, and which we'll argue a little bit later is the island of Pemba. Idris's map is somewhat similar in that what we have here is a map of, this is upside down to make it a bit easier. Here we have the Mediterranean, here we have Abu Dhabi, not marked as such, and here we actually have the East African coast, which you can see is rather devoid. And again, Idrisi has this problem about how it connects with, if you read his text, how it connects with Southeast Asia or not. So the same idea of this enclosed lake and how people perceived and confused the bottom end of East Africa with where they thought they might be in Southeast Asia. Okay, so what I want to do is take you now down a trip down the African coast, starting in the Lam Archipelago in the north and ending up right down in Madagascar and South Africa. We've been doing a lot of work here, principally through a project called Sea Links between 2010 and 2016, actually, it's slightly out of date, this slide. And you can see that there's some of the places I've marked in brown that we've been to and I'm going to mention in this talk. Huge amounts of archaeological activity, and what we've been doing is sampling these sites and getting really detailed chronological evidence, particularly in this early phase in the first millennium. So let's now start in the Lam Archipelago, the great lumber yard of the Abbasids, if you believe various people, where those poles, those mangrove poles were taken, and the teak and various other commodities were taken to build the ships, like the Belatang shipwreck probably, which was made out of African timber, but also the building materials and so forth. This is an archipelago of 3 islands, with some small islands, Manda Island, Lamu Island, and Pate Island, where we have a remarkable number of archaeological sites. One was excavated in the 1960s and 1980s by Neville Chittick, who was the director of the British Institute in East Africa, a site called Manda. And he got extremely excited because he thought this really was a colony of Sirafi merchants. He compared the plan of the houses here to those found at Siraf that had recently been excavated by David Whitehouse. He believed that this was where these merchants came to undertake this trade. We spent a lot of time trying to disprove this hypothesis, I should hasten to add, and to actually demonstrate that Manda is a very important trading port indeed, but it's in probably an African port, which is probably Muslim, rather than necessarily a colony of Persian or Arab merchants. But the ceramics found are extremely impressive, and this is a repertoire that appears both in the Gulf and also all the way down the East African coast. I won't labour the point, but we have, for example, these turquoise glazed wares, sometimes called Sasanian Islamic, which are probably containing the date syrup, which people got excited about. Various forms of glazed wares, blue splash glazed wares, which are often known as the Samara horizon from the 9th century, which are of luster and opaque glazed wares. A few pieces of Chinese ware, this is a bit of dingware, and also large jars that we know were being made in the kilns at Siraf itself. So a wide assemblage of material, but in broad terms, we actually counted the number of sherds of these imports compared to local pottery at Manda. It's about 3 or 4%. So one mustn't over-egg the fact that one's overwhelmed in all this lovely imported material. The vast bulk of the material is local. The site that I worked on for many years, Shanga, which is on Pate Island, immediately opposite to Manda, is a very similar site with a very similar range of imports, but has a slightly different story. Deep archaeology, buried underneath a 14th century town that goes down some 4 or 5 meters in depth, so the excavation of this is a nightmare. But what we have, and what we studied in particular, is that other 95% of the site that consisted of earthenware pottery, locally made earthenware pottery that we call Tana tradition. And this is interesting because this is the type fossil, if you like, of the indigenous people that are living along the coast, who are Bantu people, who are Swahili speaking. Swahili is a Bantu language. And if we compare the distribution of Bantu or Proto-Swahili languages along the coast with the distribution of this Tana tradition pottery, you can see that it has a very similar type of distribution. And so what we actually think is that these port cities along the African coast are not Arab colonies anymore, but are indigenous African communities that are assimilating ideas, Islam, contact ideas from the wider Indian Ocean world. And maybe the odd person is coming and settling in these places, but they're not essentially colonial models of a 19th century type. And deep archaeology associated with largely timber buildings. So here we have a series of circular buildings, for example, and you can get some idea of the depth of the archaeology. And this particular point, I mentioned the House of Cisterns at Manda, where we found an almost identical building at Shanga, which is here. And you can see here it is with its floors. But when we excavated underneath it, we found it was predecessor was a massive timber building in exactly the same footprint and probably exactly the same plan. And there's one of the post holes pre-excavation of this massive, great big timber structure. So in other words, these buildings are coming out of a timber tradition rather than a masonry tradition. That is almost certainly indigenous in nature. So people are adopting stone architecture because they know about it, rather than it's a result of a technological transfer, critically. Islam remains one of the key issues. To what extent these Swahili or Proto-Swahili towns were Muslim has been a long debate. So our merchants who are coming down from the Gulf, are they coming to places that are non-Islamic, are difficult places? Why would they want to trade? The difficulties of trading with such places. Or are they coming to indigenous settlements that are Muslim? Well, to test that question, we excavated the Friday Mosque at Shanga, which is a 14th century building as it stands, but the core of it is an 11th century, early 11th century building here. And we're able to go down below the floor of that prayer hall, down through the sand deposits to the earlier sequence of mosques underneath. And here we found a very remarkable sequence. So the latest standing mosque is here from about 1000 AD. Then we have an earlier stone mosque. And then underneath it, we have timber mosques, about 8 of them, one on top of another, on top of another. These are timber mosques made out of sticks brought from the mangroves. I mean, in fact, the floor weren't plaster floors, but were mud floors, again made of mud that was brought especially from the mangroves to lie the floor of the mosque. We also found one mosque, which was particularly special, which was scattered with stones, small stones. And this is really interesting because there's an early Islamic tradition about early mosques having stones on the floor, because when people would pray, if they had sand on the floor, they would have sand on their hands, would clap their hands, and the sand would go everywhere, and this was thought to be part of a ritual, so people put small stones on the mosque floor. So here we actually have a floor with stones on it in that very early Islamic tradition. And we have radiocarbon dates that go back to around 750 for these mosques. So they're not only by far the earliest mosques ever discovered in sub-Saharan Africa, but some of the very earliest mosques ever excavated in Islam at all. And there's an example, the same tradition carrying on today. Associated with these very early mosques, we have silver coins. These are with single names like Muhammad or Abdullah, and little Islamic and Arabic little couplet on the other side. They have no dates, have no reference to the caliph or anything else like this. These are being locally produced coins by people living here, who themselves are, let's put it that way, independent of the Islamic world, but still trying to be part of it. And this coining tradition we'll come back to in a second. So the Lombok Archipelago, certainly by the early 9th century, the late 8th century, it was fully connected with the Gulf. It had all these wonderful import trade items. It was Muslim, it was semi-urban, and they were producing their own coins. It's interesting, this is not a single scrap of documentary evidence for the Lam Archipelago. We have no idea what these places were really called. There's no documentary or geographical reference to this place at all. It's slightly different when we come on down to the Zanzibar archipelago. Two islands, Zanzibar and Pemba. Pemba to the north and Zanzibar to the south here. Now, these are two islands that we think are mentioned in on the Book of Curiosities as Kambalu and Languja islands. Languja, incidentally, in Bantu means to wait the monsoon, so it's a very interesting choice of place names, and is mentioned, these two islands are mentioned in Jahiz in the 9th century as places in particular where slaves are being obtained to trade up principally to the Gulf and involved in the draining of the swamps and so forth. And indeed, immediately opposite the islands of Zanzibar and Pemba, there were large Iron Age communities which kind of disappear from the archaeological record at this stage. So we suspect that these are indeed the Bantu who are being slaved. But I want to talk about, while I've got these maps on, to say a bit about Tumbe, Tanwim Ku, Rasam Kumbu, and down here at Unguja Aku. There's a map of the mainland of East Africa, opposite Zanzibar and Pemba, and you can see all these archaeological sites on this mountain range that come quite close to the coast. That would have been very densely settled by Iron Age farmers in exactly this time. And by the 10th century, these sites have practically disappeared. So the source of labour that would have been taken to the Gulf is probably from this area. So Tumbe, which is on the northern tip of Pemba Island, and may well be the place where Masudi went to, he may be where he worshipped, is a site that's only been recently discovered, and we hope maybe to work there this summer, where we have timber buildings, daub structures, and huge amounts of evidence of the manufacture of beads, of shell beads, in particular from this site. It's a very extensive site, covers about 15 hectares in area. And interestingly, it has a type of glass bead that we find that we think almost certainly comes from the Gulf and is located here, but we also find in the sites in southern Africa that we'll come back to in a minute. Masudi describes the societies of South Africa in some detail. And it may well be that this place, or Pemba Island in general, is the stopping off point. You're coming from the Gulf, you go to Pemba, and either you go no further, or that's the stopping off point to go much further south. There may be Ibadi. We have a mosque from an adjacent site, which is an Ibadi mosque with a mihrab that's set within the thickness of the wall. And there is indeed some evidence from Masudi's own testimony that this place may well be Ibadi in origin, or Harijite anyway. The other site on Pemba, Ras Umkumbu, is the place name gives it away. Umkumbu, Kambalu, is this little belt of land with 14th century material on the top. But when we investigated the hill area of the site behind, we found another massive 11th century, 10th, 11th century site with timber buildings and an enormous mosque. This is 11th century, but underneath it, just like at Shanga, we have a sequence of earlier mosques, another stone mosque, and then an earlier timber mosque. So again, probably by the 9th century, they are certainly Muslim at this point. So there's the evidence of the earlier mosque. And probably this is another Ibadi mosque as far as we can see. And then the third site, Tanwim Ku, is a sort of mysterious island, fascinatingly complex, again without many masonry buildings. But we found a hoard of coins here associated with 10 Fatimid dinars of the 11th century, the latest 1066, but associated with 2,500 locally minted silver coins. Now, these silver coins are directly descendant from those silver coins I showed you at Shanga from the 9th century. So here we have in the late 10th, early 11th century, we have about 3 generations of minters. We can check from the overminting. So this coining tradition goes back to around 1000 AD or thereabouts. These are, again, locally minted coins. So these must be local people who are part of the creating an identity, as it were, a local sultanate, if you like, at Mtamwi and Ku. And finally, in this little section, Unguja Ku, which is by far the richest of all the sites we've so far excavated. Whereas at Manda and at Tumbay, the percentage of imported pottery is about 3%. At Unguja Ku, the percentage is over 10%. They are literally living, eating off material that's coming from the Gulf. Huge quantities of turquoise glazed wares, torpedo jars, beads, glass, the whole assemblage of material. This we've been investigating using slightly new methodologies, using what we call flotation, in order to obtain the seeds, the food material that people were eating, not just to work out their diet, but also to get very precise radiocarbon dates to provide an exact chronology for these particular sites. So this is Unguja Ku. These are some of the materials. It's a lovely place to work. It's on the beach, you can see. Again, no masonry buildings. This is a daub build. This is daub and timber buildings and so forth. But you can see there's a nice gold bead here, a bit of a Chinese mirror, carnelian beads from India, an Islamic probably is incense burner, bracelet, turquoise glazed wares. And again, this is Changsha ware. So this is the Changsha painted stoneware, exactly the same type that was found on the Belatung shipwreck that we saw early on in the talk. So here we go, Changsha ware. So, but it's not mid-9th century. This Changsha ware goes back to the mid-8th century, and we can tell from the radiocarbon dates. So here we've got also some of the beads, including an eyed bead that comes from Thailand. So this is the kind of boring slide. I'm sorry, not that many boring slides, but here's a really boring slide for the scientists amongst us. You can see the deep archaeology, the complex stratigraphy that allows us to provide extremely precise chronologies using Bayesian statistics to get us the exact date range for this material. So we think that Unguja Ku is first occupied around 700, 680 AD and goes through to the 9th century. Interestingly enough, it appears to be largely abandoned in the end of the 9th century. This is exactly the same date of the Zanj revolt, when possibly the importation of African slaves rather went off people's agenda. Anyway, so if we now move on down a bit more. So Unguja Ku, we think, and Tumba and Pemba, Kambalu, may well be absolutely key entrepôts in this trading network. And most of the Gulf ships would have got that far. Did they go any further? Well, interestingly, the evidence suggests that they did. The first site that I want to talk about briefly is Kilwa. Kilwa is very well known in Swahili archaeology because it has a chronicle recorded by the Portuguese that tells the history of how the place was founded by merchants from Siraf or from Shiraz, and how it tells the story of these 7 brothers that set sail after they dreamt that the town wall of Shiraz was going to collapse, and so they took ship next day. Well, Shiraz is quite a long way from the sea, so that's a little difficult. And how they established a series of towns down the coast, and Kilwa was one of these towns. So trying to sort out this historical text with respect to the archaeology is a real challenge. Neville Chittick also excavated extensively in Kilwa in the 1960s. In fact, his last excavation was 1966. So this year we decided, or last year we decided to go back and reevaluate one of his excavations. So here's the Kilwa archipelago. You can see a bit further down the coast here. Chittick excavated in a rather old-fashioned way using D'Urqueville trucks that carried the spoil away. Not much sieving was going on there, I'm afraid. But nonetheless, he produced some interesting plans of the site. He did one test pit through the site, next to what he called the Great House, which is his large 15th century house, and he went down, right down to the natural subsoil. So in a rather sort of naughty and cheeky way, I dug a little trench next door to check his stratigraphy, to work it all out, to actually sieve the deposits, to work out what was really there. And we could really straighten out his chronology, and I won't really want to go into it, and we'll re-examine the Kilwa Chronicle in detail. Here's another rather boring archaeological story. But to say that we can trace how Kilwa, which became this fabulously important place in the 13th and 14th centuries, origins go back to the same period in the 9th or late 8th centuries, but we can trace its general rise to prosperity, almost as Zanzibar and Pemba themselves declined in prosperity. So here we have, for example, the percentages of imports that we found from that trench, and you can see from 800 there's virtually none, and then it then goes ballistic by around 1100 AD or thereabouts. We can see the Islamic types. You can see how those archaeologists amongst them will immediately recognize these types happening. And even if we look at the accounts, the raw counts of imports, again, you can see exactly the same shift happening there. So one can see how Kilwa replaces Zanzibar and Pemba as the entrepot of choice for people coming from the Gulf, the place where they could obtain their raw materials from southern Africa that were so needed in the Gulf. Interestingly, in one of those early levels, we found this rather nasty little coin, which is identical to one of the coins from the Mtamwi hoard. In fact, it's of Ali bin al-Hassan, who is meant to be the founder of the Shirazi dynasty, if you like, who we can now date very firmly to around 1000 AD. And so we've got this really interesting link between Pemba Island and Kilwa from the coin evidence. So we can now do a nice link from Lamu to Pemba to Kilwa in a rather interesting way. Kilwa is also full of beads, and beads have suddenly become the key commodity for archaeologists to understand globalization and trade links, because we can chemically characterize these beads, but at the same time we can work out their distribution. They get everywhere. Because they're so light, they give you some idea of the nature of these exchange networks. And what this recent work has done, particularly in southern Africa, has shown where effectively these commodities that are being fed into the East African coast and into those Gulf vessels, where they're actually coming from. And they're not coming from the hinterland of Zanzibar and Pemba, they're not coming from the hinterland of Kilwa, but they're actually coming down from basically the hinterland of the Mozambique coast, the area that we would call now modern Zimbabwe, but even further south in what we now call Botswana and the Republic of South Africa. And a remarkable series of investigations have taken place in eastern Botswana and in South Africa around the Limpopo River here, where many of these trade beads can now be identified, which are specifically Gulf beads. We know they're called Zizo beads. Those same Zizo beads have been found on Pemba Island and are also found down here, right down in down there in South Africa. This area, some of these sites are huge middens of worked ivory, suggesting that one of the exports is ivory, but also they're right next door to all the gold fields, which we know from Masudi and the wonders of India are being exploited by this time. So an extraordinary network. I've just shown you an example of the famous Mapungubwe rhinoceros. If you're in London the next few weeks, it's on display in the British Museum, a remarkable find in one of the royal tombs at Mapungubwe itself, probably 13th century in this case. But so you can see the working and exploitation of gold is already quite extensive at this point. The real problem is, how do you get down so far down south, down to the southern African coast? Because I think, as I've intimated, the monsoon winds kind of stop by Kilwa-ish, and how do you actually get down? How do people do this extraordinary navigation? Well, Recently, some work has been done. We love NASA. Have been putting what are called drones in the sea. Not the drones that fly above the ground, but drones. These are you put in the sea, and they have little GPSs that then communicate with satellites, and you can track them as they go round and round, following the currents. And here's a couple of drone tracks of a drone that was put into the sea there, and you can see it's going round and round and round and round. Now, the Mozambique current was seen to be an effective way of getting to South Africa, but how did you actually get back? Well, these drone images have actually shown very clearly what's happening, that if you take the African coast down one side, and then basically you then go across to Madagascar and go back on the other side, on the countercurrent, you've got a current system that enables you to navigate the Mozambique Channel. Here's another image, again, from outer space, showing this is a gravity model in this case, and you can see these circles in operation. So it seems it is possible to do these navigations, and whether it's the Swahili who are going down there, or actually the Gulf sailors, which is intimated, incidentally, from Masudi, who gives a very clear description of the kings who are living down in South Africa, so he clearly had a knowledge of the kind of state operation that was happening down there. It would suggest that maybe Gulf sailors were reaching all the way down. But there was another reason why people wanted to come down to the extreme end of the South African coast, or the southern African coast. And that is what might describe as the Austronesian element. Now, it's long been known that Madagascar has been settled, or was settled, by people from Austronesia. We know this from many strains of evidence, from the genetic evidence, which is now overwhelming, the linguistic evidence. Malagasy, the language, is an Austronesian language, a Burito, part of the Burito group of languages from southeast Borneo, southern Borneo, from here. But we also know from the crops involved, and we're also involved in these long-distance networks. And the mystery has been, when and how did that take place? Well, I think that, and we've done now a lot of work in Madagascar, and people have wanted to find Austronesians at 2000 BC, 1000 BC. My feeling is that actually it's much more recent than that. It belongs to this same great period in the 9th century, in the 8th century, when people are moving across the Indian Ocean, but also from Southeast Asia. So we'll see some evidence for this. Here is one of the sites we've been digging in northwest Madagascar, a site called Mahilika, which appears to be a great depot, a storage depot, if you like, for some of the commodities involved. You can see we've got a big fortress here in the middle at Mahilika. But another site on the east coast, a little island called Nusa Manga Bay, where we have Sasanian Islamic or turquoise glazewares, one sherd. We have some opaque glazewares, up in 3 sherds, and we are a very, very long way away, I may hasten to add. But also this very interesting lump of rock crystal. Madagascar is the main source for the production of rock crystal in the Islamic world. We have very good, Baruni tells us about this, that a lot of the rock crystal is coming both to the Gulf and to the Fatimid world to create those great Fatimid ewers, is coming probably from Madagascar. And we actually have archaeological level, historical, these are the lumps, enormous lumps of rock crystal that can be found on the northeast coast of Madagascar, and still can be found in river valleys and so forth. There's still a brisk trade in this very, very clear and very, very translucent rock crystal. And when we've looked at, Mahilika was full of chippings from this rock crystal, but also when we've looked at the Comores, which is this little archipelago of islands between Madagascar and the mainland of Africa, again, the sites that we've excavated are full of chippings of rock crystal. So there is a reason to go to Madagascar as well, but our model is that actually the Comores seems to be the main entrepot where people are trying to reach. It's where, if you sailed across from Southeast Asia, but also coming down the East African coast, is a natural entrepot. And we have a series of sites on the archipelago, the Comoran archipelago. There were 4 islands, or 4 principal islands. One, Mayotte, is actually still part of France, a French colony. The other 3 are an independent country. They're basically volcanoes sitting out in the middle of the ocean, and they're full of wonderful archaeology. So this is one site called Sima, or Old Sima, on the island of Anjouan. And here we have archaeological evidence. We have good pits full of rubbish, which is the good stuff for archaeologists. And this includes ceramics. And these ceramics are extremely interesting because they're halfway between the Tana tradition pottery I was telling you about earlier, but also have Southeast Asian influences, the use of red slip on them, and these little dentates along the rim of the vessel, which has a very Southeast Asian feel about it. So is it possible that the Comores are this sort of entrepot between Africa and Southeast Asia? Well, the best evidence for that comes from the food crops. Whereas in Gujuku and those other sites along the coast are entirely African crops, what we find on the Comores is that the crops are entirely of Southeast Asian origin. They're eating rice, they're eating mung bean, they've got cotton, they've got baobab. Sorry, they've got cotton, they've got mung bean, and large amounts of rice. And this is very good preservation of the rice. Not a single piece of African food crop here. So this is a really good indicator. We published a few months ago in PNAS a really good indicator that these sites have this very close and intimate knowledge link with Southeast Asia as well. So this summer we excavated a site on Grand Comore called Mbeni, a site that's been heavily damaged by erosion. And here we have the same assemblage of ceramics as in Old Sima. You can see the dentate wares here. But very interestingly, we also found in this 8th century level a sherd of pottery called AMV ware, which is exactly the same as we excavated in Nozamanga Bay from Madagascar. So we've got this interesting link in this rather nasty sherd of pottery between 8th century Comores and Madagascar. Not surprising, but a very interesting and useful confirmation that these places are connected in the 8th century. But another site was remarkable on this same site. It had been destroyed by the seas, so we had to excavate virtually under the sea, between tides, if you like. Full of turquoise glazed ware. There's a nice image of what they actually look like from the Qatar National Museum, if you want a nice example of what this nasty stuff looks like, full of date syrup. But you'll see here in the middle, we have a sherd of Changsha stoneware, the first sherd from the Comores or so far south. So if we just do a sort of picture here, there is the Changsha from the Belatong wreck, and here is the Changsha from Mbeni. It could have come off it almost exactly the same. So here we've got an interesting example. Now, it's possible that this Changsha is coming all the way from the Gulf and then all the way down the coast of Africa. But where was the Belatong shipwreck actually found? Well, here we've got off the islands under Belatong, or the southern end of Sumatra. Now, most people have argued that it got that far south because it was swept down by a great typhoon and got shipwrecked, or it was going into Srivijaya, which is up here somewhere. We don't really know where the capital Srivijaya was, somewhere up here, and it lost its way. And there's an awful lot of special pleading. Another possibility is actually it's coming down through the Sunda Straits rather than the Malacca Straits to the north, and in which case, is it actually going directly to East Africa? Is it actually directly going to the Comores rather than... and if you do that, if you work out the routing, you knock about 6 months off the overall journey. And you can see that you can take the very reliable southeast trades that take you across from here, take you across in July, across following latitude, sailing all the way across to the Comores. And in fact, people have done it. They've done endless replications of these voyages. One in the 1960s, 1980s that took 46 days, and one in the early 2000s that took 26 days, or it would have taken 26 days, but they were diverted to the Seychelles to have a hot shower. But, you know, it is possible to do these things. Well, I'll just go back. This sort of lay in the realm of speculation until in the mid-2000s, another shipwreck was found very close to the Belatongue ship, which is the Cirebon wreck. This lies off immediately the north coast of Java, and it's different from the Belatongue wreck. It's a what's called lash lug and dowel constructed vessel, so it's not a Western Indian Ocean type, but most likely a Southeast Asian type of vessel. And was excavated by commercial divers, and a very, very large quantity of material was found here. So there's the plan of the vessel. It's actually rather better recorded than the Belatongue shipwreck. It's about 36 meters in size, so it's twice the size of the Belatongue shipwreck. If you put that in perspective, it's twice the size also, or just under twice the size of the ships that Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic to discover the New World. So these are massive vessels. They're not tiny little boats with outriggers that people have visualized, but enormous vessels. It's been estimated that on this was upwards of 400,000 Chinese bowls from the 10th century. So this material is in the most enormous quantities. But I don't want to dwell much on the Chinese material because, well, fortunately, the collection of the Cirebon ship has been acquired by the Qatar National Museums, and so we can begin to look in more detail of what is actually on this vessel. And what's interesting is while it's got this huge quantity of Chinese vessels, it also has an enormous quantity of material from the Gulf, including, there's a little display, lots of Gulf glassware, for example. This is some of the Chinese wares here, but also, you're getting bored with this stuff, turquoise glazed wares, and here we go, another Sirafi jar. So there's no doubt at all that they pass by. We also like to know it's also full of rock crystal, chips of rock crystal, probably from Madagascar. And you can see that this rock crystal is almost identical to the one I showed you, a modern example from here, but also rock crystal balls. An example of rock crystal carving that's probably Gulf in origin, this extraordinary fish, a little vial from there. About 1.5 tons of lapis lazuli, for example. Huge quantities of beads, exactly the same type of beads that we find in these East African towns, some of which come from Western India, some of which come from Thailand, some of which come from the Gulf. Sapphires, rubies, again, which must come from Sri Lanka or southern India. So suddenly we're seeing a cargo vessel that's just full of the material of the world moving around the Indian Ocean. And I think we've just got to totally change how we think of the world of the Indian Ocean in the 8th and 9th centuries. We need to slightly move away from the documents and the single tour stories to actually have a much bigger idea of the connections that's happening. That these Gulf ships are coming down to East Africa in order to obtain the ivory that they can then take on to China to acquire the ceramics and so forth that they bring back. They may be coming actually all the way back from China via East Africa rather than the long route up through the Malacca Straits and through India. They may be exchanging all these precious raw materials in a very complex way. They may be acquiring some of these Chinese ceramics not from China, but actually from the Comores, where these great Indonesian vessels are actually turning up. So if I just finish with two last images, first of all, here is the world of the Cirebon shipwreck, or you could say almost the Belatongue shipwreck as well, which is an almost exact carbon copy of those earlier images I showed you from those documentary sources. Abu Zaid al-Sarafi in the 10th century, or 9th century, who describes this world. You can see this is where the material culture of the Indian Ocean is being brought together in just this one frozen moment of this shipwreck. And I'm just going to rather cheekily end up with a slight modification to my earlier plan that I showed you to show that maybe we're escaping the truth. That in fact, people are moving across the Indian Ocean. That Madagascar is being settled because it's part of a trade network with Southeast Asia. Not because you've got the odd vessel that's got shipwrecked and blown across, well, like sort of MH 370, where all the debris, if you remember, turned up on the Madagascan coast. No, this is a globalizing world, and I suppose in part of that globalizing world, the Gulf plays an absolute key role because it's the fulcrum of all these really interesting and phenomenal long-distance networks. So I hope I've kind of hoped to show, I mean, some of this is speculation, but, you know, the more archaeology we go, the more remarkable now the evidence comes that essentially we're not talking about globalization in the 19th century or the 13th century or the 15th century, but we're talking about globalization in the 8th and 9th centuries, and the Gulf is key in that story. Thank you. Yeah, plenty. Yeah. Microphone. I overwhelmed you. Come to gush, yes, come on. Here, that.
Is there any archaeological evidence, sorry. Is there archaeological evidence for continuity with Sasanian maritime practices in the materials that you discover, or does this seem to be a thing that's new with the coming of Islam and the Islamic era?
Well, that's a very big and interesting question. Okay, so we have sites at the very bottom of Ngujukum. We have another site in the northern tip of Zanzibar called Fukuchani, which has no turquoise glazeware, but just has Sasanian-type torpedo jars. We have a site on the very tip of Somalia, a place called Ras Hafun, that is clearly part of also a trade network that has Sasanian material in it. So I think that dating this material is the real issue. And when does Islam begin, in terms of people identifying themselves as Sasanian traders rather than Muslim traders? I mean, the same issue has happened at Siraf, where the fort, which was thought to be a Sasanian fort, we now think is early Islamic in date. But these settlements in East Africa, it's very difficult to push it much before the late 7th century. But you never know. We might dig a hole and find some.
Thank you for your talk. I have two questions. The first one, to whom does the material that you find belong to when you do this archaeological work? Where does it go?
It's a local museum.
Whose local museum?
Well, whatever we're working obviously under permit from the local antiquities department. So in Zanzibar and Pemba, for example, there's a museum of archives and museum of antiquities, and so the material is all curated in the museum there. In Tanzania, it's curated by the Antiquities Service there, and so on and so forth.
The second question would be how your archaeological work helps in social archaeology, if that is a term I could use. For example, now we have trade relations with other countries, but it really somehow you feel sometimes it doesn't affect our social interaction with them. Could you give us an idea about that?
So you're thinking about modern social archaeology, as it were. Yeah, I mean, that's maybe one of the reasons why I'm here. I think that there is this material. I mean, it'd be fantastic for some of this material to come on temporary exhibition and so forth. I mean, just simply the wow factor. I mean, it's very easy in a talk like this to show you pictures and maps and so forth. But the wow factor, you just think of the thousands of kilometers that people are traveling and this material is going over. You know, it is just mind-boggling. And I think just to see the stuff and to understand, it has a real important public story to be told, not just an academic one. So I'm sure that, relations between, and I think relations between the East African countries and Gulf countries are getting much stronger. They want the money. one thing.
Thank you for the great lecture, Mark. I had a question about rock crystal. You mentioned showing the source, I think, on the east coast of Mozambique, and I just wondered if there can be many other sources for rock crystal. The reason I say that is because we find rock crystal beads dating to between 5,000 to 5,500 BC on some of the islands along the coast west of Abu Dhabi, so on the Neolithic sites that I'm excavating on Marawa and on Dalma. And they are quite rare. They're about, maybe 1-2% of the total bead assemblage. Most of the beads are made from shells, but I think there must be some other source of rock crystal. They're being drilled and prepared actually on the islands in Abu Dhabi, so there must be another source of rock crystal that's nearer to our area. I think I don't imagine that in the Neolithic period they're getting all the way to Mozambique.
Madagascar. No, I think absolutely. No, I think we know that. Rock crystal is quite a common mineral, and there's India, Sri Lanka. There's quite a lot. There's quite a lot from Afghanistan as well. There's known about. There's quite the sources in Europe as well. The key thing about the Madagascan rock crystal is two things. One of which is exceptionally clear, and secondly, it comes in very, very large lumps, which enables you to create these ewers and so forth in a way, because most of the sources of rock crystal around the world, until really Brazil was discovered in the 6th, 17th century as a source, are quite small pieces. So you can make beads and so forth with them. But when you're starting to make these much more elaborate works of art, you really need Madagascan rock crystal to do it.
Yes, we have quite nice kind of tubular sort of beads, and they're very carefully drilled, and it must still be quite difficult making them, especially in the 6th millennium BC.
Absolutely, yes. And rock crystal is extremely hard. Although, the technology we kind of know, people still work it, so we can work out exactly how it's done using carborundum and so forth to drill with.
Okay, thank you.
We can't chemically characterize rock crystal at the moment. That's one of the problems because it's so pure.
Hello, thank you for the great lecture. I'm Difa Al-Amri, and I just have one question. In one of the photos, there was a photo of a mosque, and on the ground there were stones, and you said that Muslims don't like praying on sand.
Yes.
And I was just curious, from where did you conclude that? From the people, or?
No, it's well recorded in some of the early Islamic literature. There's a tradition. There is a tradition. Actually, it's even if you look at Cresswell, for example, he mentions it. For example, in early Islamic architecture.
I was just curious because until now we have some Muslims who actually pray on the rocks.
On rocks, yes.
On rocks, yeah.
So the tradition continues.
A tradition and religion. So,
yes.
Isn't
that fascinating? Yes.
It is.
Just
Thank you.
Extraordinary continuity. So there we actually have people deliberately covering the mosque floor with small stones in 780 or something.
Hi. Are you planning to continue research? And if so, what are the key data gaps that you're interested in filling? And do you have an overall hypothesis that you want to prove?
Well, I kind of gave you a bit of an overall hypothesis, I think. So where are the data gaps? Well, obviously we need to do more work on the Comores. This is really the beginning of archaeology on the Comores on any scale. The Mozambique coast really needs to be looked at in more detail. We have sites down the Mozambique coast, but haven't really been looked at for many years using new methodologies. Getting proper chronologies is really key to work out the date, to be able to use radiocarbon dates, to be able to tie down the dates of these sites very, very precisely. So that's an important data gap. And we just need more data, really, more sites. I showed you an area, 4,000 miles long, something like that. We saw 10 sites. You might have thought it was 10, when was it ever going to finish? But, there is a huge amount of stuff there. And the thing about archaeology is that when we do archaeology, we always find surprising stuff, and often it must annoy historians no end when we completely change our mind because we find something completely new in the bottom of a pit.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. Just a question: has the change of sea level actually is that noticeable over all this time? Do you think that there are sites that are now underwater that you might want to explore?
Well, that's a very interesting question. There's two things that's happening. But we puzzle about sea level the entire time, and there are terraces to suggest that sea level has gone down and gone up, and there's a bit of variability. Africa, by and large, as a landmass, is quite stable. So you're not getting static uplift or down thing. Essentially, it's reasonably stable. So any sea level rise is what's global sea level rise that's happening. So we wouldn't expect, like, for example, the coast of India, where there are probably sites which are very deeply underwater. East Africa, we don't think that's happening necessarily. But what is certainly happening is erosion. And we get traditions of people say, oh, the city is under the sea. And then we go to that site and we see that actually what's really happened is that the sea has eroded away, 300, 400, 500 meters of shoreline. And so the city really is under sea, but actually it's not because of sea level rise, but because of erosion. But yes, there are claims about sunken cities and so forth, which have been in the press recently. They are probably not true.
Mark, I have a question about Siraf, because it was...
About what?
Siraf.
Yes.
Well, because I was wondering all the time, while you were speaking, where the entrepôts or where the ports were in the Gulf. And of course, Siraf is one of them. But it was destroyed by an earthquake in the 10th century?
Yes. Or a series of earthquakes, actually.
Sorry?
A series of earthquakes, actually.
Yeah. So that was no longer a port. So, does it impact the history that you're
Yes, it's a really interesting question. What seems to be happening, we can see this happening in terms of the type of imported pottery. So the assemblage associated with those turquoise glazewares and Sirafi jars in the late 10th century disappears and is replaced by what we would call sgraffiato wares that's probably being made in the Makran area of southern Iran. And it would seem that the ports at the entrance to the Gulf become much more important in the 11th century. So we see the rise of Kish and Old Hormuz and places. And this may well be also linked, and also ports all along the southern Arabian coast as well. There's a very interesting port that's recently published, a place called Sharma on the southern Arabian coast, which belongs to this post-Sirafian period. In fact, people have suggested even that Sharma might well be a place of Sirafian refugees that go off to Sharma. The interesting thing about Sharma is also that something like 30 or 40% of the pottery at Sharma is African. So it may well be playing a role again in this post-Sirafian period. But also don't forget that in the 10th century we're seeing the rise of the Fatimid world and Fatimid maritime trade between the Red Sea and India. So that may also be drawing people out of the Gulf as the sort of the Red Sea India route then becomes really important and appearing in the Jewish Geniza documents and so forth. So yes, everything sort of changes 1000 AD-ish, and we can see that reflected. But invite me back and I'll tell you about that.
Sorry, I didn't know. Pleasure. I had another question about the last wreck.
Cirebon.
The Cirebon, yeah. Because it seemed like it had everything on board. So, that's a puzzle to me, because if it had all the Chinese pottery and stuff from the Gulf, and it also had the crystals, it seemed to be going around not offloading anything, just like some kind of magpie across the. I don't understand how everything was on board.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure we do either. Actually,
it was going back.
I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, how do these vessels actually operate? Did they have you know, if they couldn't sell all their lapis, if these enormous vessels, if they couldn't sell all their lapis lazuli or whatever, did they just keep it on board to see if they could find a market a bit somewhere else where they were, you know? Were the small number of sherds of turquoise glazeware ships, crews, foodware, for example, that had got stuck? You know, there must be all sorts of ways in which this type of mixed assemblage, I mean, there's no doubt it's coming from China because it's got just overwhelming quantity of Chinese wares, but it may be picking stuff up, stuff might get lost in the bottom. I mean, you know, these vessels are notoriously difficult to get down, you know, clean them out and so forth. So, you know, there may be all sorts of processes. I mean, I just think we do not understand how these vessels operated. It's an evasive answer, but
Yes, thank you very much. I wondered, I may be mistaken, but my impression was that the buildings, housing you excavated in East Africa was not very large. And I wondered if people in that region were getting rich from this trade or not, or if this is a global system in which the gains from the globalization were accruing unequally. If there was a core where people were actually gaining much more, and perhaps you're excavating the periphery where the gains from globalization are smaller.
Well, that's a really interesting question, yes. To what extent, I mean, it's quite clear that what we're seeing in the archaeology is just simply the fragments, the tiny fragments left behind. I mean, you know, if you think of even Bellaton with 60,000 pieces of Changsha, and we're getting excited because we've excavated 4 pieces, tiny sherds, you know, what's actually being left behind? So, yes, one could argue that actually they're not building elaborate buildings, they're not really investing, certainly not until really the 13th or 14th century when we're starting to see real port cities developing with really complex architecture. So yes, I agree that, you know, how are they expressing their wealth and so forth that they're generating, and that's a puzzle. One more question, then. Can we have some to eat? Do we have some to eat?
Hi.
Enjoy the fruits of globalization.
So I'm wondering, you mentioned that we really don't understand how these vessels worked and like the way they operated and how the trade operated. So I'm wondering what we can do to better understand it, to understand how the vessels themselves operated.
Well, there's 2 tracks, one of which is to look at historical sources that have not been properly looked at before. And the most obvious source of that are the Geniza documents that refer to a slightly later period, but give some indication of the nature of the kind of social organization on some of these vessels and how particularly how merchants are operating independently. So they're buying they're buying a passage, if you like, on the vessel, rather than actually supporting the entire vessel, whether that's the case earlier on. So looking at the Geniza documents, the India book, that's never been, it's still being worked on today. So there's, you know, an amazing quantity of material still there available. And let's just pray that we find some shipwrecks that we can excavate archaeologically rather than via commercial treasure hunters, effectively, who are mostly interested in making a profit and not really in terms of investigating the hull structures in detail, because I think, again, if we could actually excavate one of these sites properly and take a long time over it, then we might get a lot more information.